Some feelings arrive fully formed. You recognize them immediately: sadness, anger, joy. But there are others that don't arrive with names at all. They sit somewhere between emotions, too specific to ignore, too unclear to explain. And most of the time, we reduce them. We call everything stress, or overthinking, or just a bad day. Not because that's accurate, but because language runs out too quickly. This is where literature begins to matter in a different way, not as something you read for meaning, but as something that expands what you're able to name. When you read closely, you start noticing something subtle. Writers don't always give emotions direct labels. They describe situations, sensations, pauses in thought, and somehow you recognize yourself in them before you can explain why. There's a reason for that. Emotional language isn't fixed, it's learned. And often it's learned through exposure, through repetition, through reading. When Virginia Woolf writes about consciousness, she doesn't simply name emotions, she describes how they move, how thoughts overlap, how feelings interrupt each other, how nothing stays in one clean form. And in that, readers begin to recognize their own internal experience more precisely. Not because it becomes simpler, but because it becomes more articulate. The same happens in poetry. Sylvia Plath doesn't reduce emotional states into general terms. She sharpens them. She gives texture to things most people only feel vaguely. And suddenly, what felt unnamed inside you starts to feel closer to language. Not perfect language, but possible language. This is one of the quiet functions of reading that often gets overlooked. It expands your emotional vocabulary without teaching you definitions. It teaches you recognition. And recognition is where naming begins. Because before you can name what you feel, you need to be able to distinguish it from other feelings. Is this heaviness, sadness, or something closer to emotional fatigue? Is this restlessness, anxiety, or anticipation with no direction? These distinctions matter more than they seem, because once you can see the difference, you're no longer overwhelmed by a single undefined mass of feeling. You're working with something more specific, something you can relate to differently. Writing then becomes the next step in that process. Not to explain the feeling, but to test language against experience. You might write, "This doesn't feel like sadness, it feels like I'm carrying something I haven't named yet." And that sentence, even if imperfect, begins to do something important. It slows down the assumption that everything must fit into familiar emotional categories. It allows ambiguity to exist without forcing resolution. There's also something important happening here at a deeper level. When you expand your emotional vocabulary, you also expand your emotional precision. You start noticing differences that were previously flattened, and that changes how you respond to yourself. Not everything becomes one feeling anymore. It becomes layered, specific, nuanced, and that nuance creates space. Space to understand yourself without rushing to conclusions. If you think about it, many emotional struggles aren't about feeling too much. They're about not having enough language for what you feel. And literature slowly builds that language inside you. Not directly, but through repeated encounters with other minds trying to do the same thing. So maybe it's not about what you are feeling, maybe it's about what language have you not yet learned for what you're experiencing right now. Ask yourself the same question and notice what comes close to the answer, because sometimes naming your emotion doesn't begin with certainty. It begins with reading something and quietly thinking that I didn't know this had a name, but I think I felt this before. I will come back tomorrow with more feelings and more observations. I hope you do too.